Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
Yeah, DNA from a shawl recovered at the scene of one of his crimes has incredibly found a 100% match.
In 2007, a historian buys a stained silk shawl at an auction. It's a relic from the most infamous crime scene in history. For years, he works in secret with a geneticist to pull DNA from the fabric. What they found, they claim, is the name of Jack the Ripper. The world's biggest cold case is apparently solved. But the thing nobody tells you is that this DNA test has been ripped apart by experts. We're going to show you the name, but you won't believe the real story behind the science. When the fog had a name. In the late 19th century, the Whitechapel district of London was not just a place, it was a nightmare. To put it mildly, this section of the East End was a stark symbol of urban poverty. It was a labyrinth of narrow, filthy streets packed to overflowing with families, immigrants, and laborers all just trying to survive. What many overlooked is that this wasn't just poverty, it was a different world. The stench, by all accounts, was overpowering. The air was thick with the smell of tanneries, slaughterhouses, and horse manure that caked the cobblestone streets. Thousands were crammed into rookeries, which were sprawling, collapsing slum buildings. Many lived in doss houses, where you could pay a few pennies to sleep on a lice-ridden bed. If you couldn't afford that, you paid 1 penny for the 4-penny hangover, where you were allowed to sleep leaning over a rope strung across the room. By 1888, this district was a hotbed for crime and desperation. And then there was the fog. This wasn't the clean white mist you see in movies. This was the pea super, a thick, yellowish-brown, toxic fog caused by countless coal fires mixing with the natural mist from the River Thames. The fog was so thick with sulfur and soot that you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. It muffled sound, distorted shadows, and needless to say, provided the perfect cover for anyone wanting to do harm. This grim backdrop, this world of shadows and hardship, set the stage for a chilling series of events that would horrify not just London, but the entire world. The terrible crimes blamed on Jack the Ripper happened in a very short, intense burst, from August to November of 1888. The terror began with the attack on Mary Ann Nichols on August 31st. She was followed just over a week later by Annie Chapman on September 8th. These first victims were both local women struggling with poverty and living on the absolute margins of society. But what shocked everyone wasn't just the attacks, it was the way they were done. The victims were subjected to horrific acts in a way that suggested the attacker had some kind of anatomical knowledge. This single detail sent a shiver of fear through the public. Was the attacker a doctor, a surgeon, or a butcher? The third victim, Elizabeth Stride, was found on September 30th, followed just hours later by Catherine Eddowes. This double event, as it came to be known, proved the attacker was bold, fast, and operating without fear. The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was discovered on November 9th. Her situation was the most horrific of all, as the attack happened indoors, giving the monster all the time in the world. The impact on Victorian society was profound. The events exposed the ugly truth about the deep class divides in London, but it also triggered something new, a media frenzy. This was the birth of the modern true crime story. Newspapers fighting for readers sensationalized the crimes with shocking headlines and wild theories. And then came the letters. On September 27th, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. It was written in red ink, taunting the police for their failures. It was signed with a new, chilling nickname, Jack the Ripper. At first, police and the press thought it was a hoax, just a sick joke. But then, 3 days later, the double event happened. The attacker struck twice. The press published the letter, and the name Jack the Ripper exploded into the public's mind. The monster now had a name. The police investigation, led by Chief Inspector Frederick Aberline, AB Airline, was, to put it bluntly, a mess. They were hampered by the period's basic forensic science. There was no fingerprinting, no blood typing. The crime scenes were often trampled by crowds before police could even secure them. Even worse, the police's own methods worked against them. Officers walked a beat, a specific route they had to patrol. They were supposed to pass any given point every 15 to 30 minutes. But the thing is, the attacker was smart. He knew the beats. He operated in the exact window of time, the dark minutes between one officer leaving and the next arriving. He could strike and vanish into the fog-filled labyrinth before the officer's whistle could even be blown. The police were blind, and in that darkness the monster began his work. But who were the women who met this terrible fate? The Canonical Five. The chilling story of Jack the Ripper is forever tied to the tragic lives of 5 women known as the Canonical Five. These weren't just names in a history book, they were real people, each struggling to survive in the brutal world of Whitechapel. What many overlooked is that their lives were just as harsh as their ends. Mary Ann Nichols, the first, was 43. She had endured a hard life, separated from her husband and living in and out of workhouses. On the night she was attacked, she had been turned out of her doss house because she didn't have the 4 pence for a bed. She told a friend she'd get the money on the street, saying, "I'll soon get my doss money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." She was last seen alive at 2:30 in the morning. She was found just 1 hour later. The coroner at her inquest noted she was missing 2 teeth and had a bruise on her face, likely from a fight earlier that day. Just over a week later, Annie Chapman was found. She was 47. Like Nichols, her life was marked by poverty and addiction. She was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. This is where the mystery deepens. When she was found, her few belongings were laid out near her feet: a small comb, a piece of a torn envelope, and a few coins. It's a detail that has haunted historians for decades. Was it a ritual or just the contents of her pocket spilling out? The attacks were becoming more savage and the public panic began to grow. Then came the double event on September 30th, which cemented the Ripper's terrifying reputation. Elizabeth Stride, 44, was found first in Dutefield's yard. But you see, her attacker was likely interrupted. A man driving a cart and pony saw him and the attacker fled. This interruption, however, seems to have only angered him. This is the truly brazen part. Just 45 minutes later and less than a mile away, the body of Catherine Eddowes was found. She was 46, but she wasn't found in Whitechapel. She was found in Mitre Square in the City of London. This was a different police jurisdiction. The City of London is only 1 square mile, but it was the richest part of the world, and as a result, it was crawling with police. To strike there showed an incredible, terrifying arrogance. This attack was incredibly brutal, with the attacker taking gruesome trophies. It was as if he was mocking the authorities. The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was the youngest at only 25. Her end was the most gruesome by far. Unlike the others who were attacked in dark alleys, Kelly was in her own small room at 13 Miller's Court. The attacker had privacy and time. The scene discovered by the landlord the next morning was so horrific that seasoned police officers were stunned into silence. It was a level of savagery that signaled the end of the spree, a terrible finale. What linked all 5, besides the geography, was the horrific signature of the attacker. He seemed to be methodical, possibly possessing surgical or anatomical knowledge, a detail that fueled the press and terrified the public. The city was in a panic, but the Ripper's methods, they were just getting started. A list of monsters. The attacker's ability to move unseen through Whitechapel suggested he was a local, or at least knew the labyrinth of alleys like the back of his hand. His targets were women selling the only thing they had, the most vulnerable people in London. He could lure them into a dark courtyard with the promise of a few coins and vanish into the fog-filled night before anyone heard a thing. The thing is, he operated with terrifying speed. In several cases, witnesses reported seeing the victim alive just minutes before her body was found. He was a ghost, and the investigation was failing. The police were overwhelmed. They received hundreds, if not thousands, of tips, and then came more letters, each one more disturbing than the last. We already mentioned the Dear Boss letter that gave the attacker his name. The police thought it was a hoax until the double event happened. In that letter, the writer promised to clip the lady's ears off. When Catherine Eddowes was found, a piece of her ear had been detached. This, to put it mildly, made the police rethink everything. Was the letter writer the real deal? Just one day after the double event, on October 1st, another piece of mail arrived. This time, it was a postcard stained with what looked like blood. It was addressed to the Central News Agency. It read, "I was not caughting dear old boss when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow, double event this time." Because it referenced the two attacks before the details were widely public, many believed this Saucy Jackie postcard was also authentic. But the most terrifying piece of mail arrived on October 16th. It was sent to George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local businessmen who had started their own patrols. The package was a small cardboard box. Inside was half of a human kidney preserved in spirits of wine. The letter that came with it was sloppy, full of misspellings, and truly chilling. It began, "From hell." The writer claimed he had fried and ate the other half of the kidney, saying it was very nice. Was this real? Catherine Eddowes' body was missing a kidney. Police surgeons were divided. Some said it matched, others said it was a crude hoax. Real or not, it cemented the Ripper as a mythological, cannibalistic monster in the public's mind. This led to the Ripperologists, an army of amateur and professional detectives who for over a century have pointed the finger at a bizarre list of suspects. One of the top suspects for the police at the time was Montague John Druitt. He was a barrister and teacher who, to put it mildly, had his own troubles. He vanished right after the last attack and was later found in the River Thames, having taken his own life. Inspector Aberline himself believed Druitt was the man, thinking his family may have known he was the monster. Then there was Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who was in London at the time. He was a known misogynist who kept a collection of medical specimens in jars. He was arrested on a minor charge but fled the country back to America, and many believed he was the Ripper escaping justice. Another was George Chapman, whose real name was Severin Klosowski. He was also a Polish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel. Years later, he was found guilty of poisoning 3 of his wives. When he was arrested, Inspector Aberline, the original detective, reportedly told the arresting officer, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." And what about Jill the Ripper? Believe it or not, this was a serious theory. It would explain how the attacker could be seen covered in blood and not be noticed. In Whitechapel, a midwife, covered in blood from a delivery, would have been a common sight and ignored by everyone. And then there was a suspect who was barely a footnote at the time, but one who was on the police's radar. Aaron Kosminsky. He was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who lived in the heart of Whitechapel and worked as a hairdresser. He was known to be mentally unstable, paranoid, and reportedly harbored a strong hatred of women. Police notes from the time name him as a strong possibility, but he was eventually committed to an asylum in 1891, where he stayed for the rest of his life. He was a sad, sick man, but was he Jack the Ripper? For decades, these names were all anyone had: theories, speculation, and ghost stories. Then, a scientist bought an old shawl at an auction. Case closing evidence. This is where the story takes a sharp turn into the 21st century. In 2007, an author and armchair detective named Russell Edwards bought a large silk shawl at an auction. The shawl's backstory, its provenance, was incredible. It was claimed that the shawl was found at the scene of Catherine Eddowes' attack, stained with her blood and taken by a police officer who gave it to his wife. It had supposedly been passed down in his family, unwashed, for over 120 years. Edwards had a theory. If the shawl was real, it could hold genetic evidence. He teamed up with Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist at Liverpool John Moores University, to do what was once impossible: extract DNA from the ancient degraded fabric. The challenge, to put it mildly, was immense. The shawl was old, fragile, and almost certainly contaminated from over a century of being handled. But Dr. Louhelainen went to work. Using advanced techniques, he focused on the visible stains. Here's the first breakthrough they announced. They managed to extract mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA. Now, it's important to understand what this is in simple terms. This isn't the unique nuclear DNA you see on TV, which is like your social security number. mtDNA is different. It's passed down only from a mother to her children, and her daughters pass it to their children, and so on. It's more like a family name for your maternal line. It's not a unique fingerprint, but it can link people to a shared maternal ancestor. They found 2 types of mitochondrial DNA on the shawl. First, they needed to prove the shawl was real. They found one mtDNA profile in what looked like blood. They had to find a living relative of Catherine Eddowes. This was a needle in a haystack. They had to use genealogical records to trace Eddowes' family line, specifically through her sisters and their daughters. After a huge search, they found a living descendant. They tested her DNA and it was a match. For Edwards and Luhalainen, this was the smoking gun. It proved the shawl was genuinely from the crime scene. Second, they tested other stains that might have come from the attacker. On these stains, they found another different mtDNA profile. Now they had to match this profile to a suspect. Edwards was convinced the attacker was Aaron Kosminsky. So they had to do the same thing, trace Kosminsky's family tree through his sister's line to find a living person who would share his exact mtDNA. Again, after a long genealogical hunt, they found one. They got a DNA sample, and it was a match. The news exploded. In 2014, Edwards published a book declaring the case solved. Aaron Kosminsky, the unstable hairdresser from Whitechapel, was Jack the Ripper. In 2019, Dr. Luhalainen and his colleague published a paper in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, seemingly giving the claim its official scientific stamp of approval. The world's greatest mystery was over. But not all things are what they seem. The thing nobody tells you in the headlines is that almost immediately the scientific community didn't just question the findings, they tore them to shreds. Here's the real story. The unsolved mystery. So what's the bottom line? Did this DNA test, this supposed silver bullet from the 21st century, finally rewrite everything we thought we knew about Jack the Ripper? The answer, overwhelmingly and perhaps disappointingly, is no. What many overlooked in the tidal wave of media hype is that the evidence derived from the infamous shawl is, at best, deeply flawed, and at worst, completely and utterly meaningless. It's a house of cards built on contaminated silk, and it all starts with the shawl itself. Its history, its provenance, is incredibly shaky. There is precisely zero evidence, not one single line item in the original meticulous police records from 1888 that a shawl was ever collected from the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder. This isn't a small oversight, it's a huge, gaping problem. The shawl was supposedly taken by a police sergeant, Amos Simpson, who wanted to give it to his wife. This story only emerged decades later, passed down through the family. For all we know, it's just a piece of old silk, perhaps from the right period, that has had a powerful and profitable myth attached to it. It's an artifact of folklore, not forensics. But let's play devil's advocate. Let's say, for one tantalizing second, the shawl is real. Let's say it was there, soaked in the victim's blood and misery. The second problem is contamination. And it is here, to put it mildly, that the entire case for the DNA doesn't just fall apart, it disintegrates into dust. Here's the kicker, the detail that changes absolutely everything. Before the shawl's owner, Russell Edwards, gave it to Dr. Jari Luhalainen for the 2014 and 2019 tests, he had already approached another, far more famous scientist. That scientist was Dr. Alec Jeffreys. If that name sounds familiar, it should. This is the man who invented DNA fingerprinting. He is quite literally the father of forensic DNA. And what did Sir Alec Jeffreys do when presented with this holy grail of ripperology? He took one look at the shawl and refused to test it. He stated publicly and unequivocally that it was hopelessly contaminated. It had been handled by countless people for over 130 years. It had been touched, breathed on, and stored improperly. Any DNA on it could have come from anyone, from Sergeant Simpson's wife, from her descendants, from museum curators, from Russell Edwards himself, or from the scientists doing the testing. It was a poisoned chalice of evidence. The 2019 paper that was finally published, the one that claimed to seal the deal, was even more controversial. It was heavily, brutally criticized by geneticists and forensic scientists around the world. Why? It was published in a journal, yes, but it was a minor one, and crucially, it didn't include the raw, fundamental data. This meant other scientists couldn't check their work. They couldn't replicate the findings. It's like turning in a high-stakes math test with just the final answer but none of the equations or calculations. It's the single biggest red flag in modern science. Experts who did look at the fragmented data that was provided said the analysis was full of schoolboy errors. They claimed the researchers had misinterpreted the already damaged genetic sequences. Even the mtDNA match was criticized into oblivion. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, isn't like the unique nuclear DNA that can pinpoint one person. It's passed down from a mother to all her children, and it remains unchanged through the maternal line for generations. The specific mitochondrial DNA profile they match to a descendant of Kosminsky's sister is not rare. At all. It belongs to a haplogroup that is, in fact, incredibly common in Europe. Finding it on a shawl in London is about as surprising or as forensically useful as finding a pigeon in Trafalgar Square. It doesn't prove it was Kosminsky, it just proves the DNA might have come from, well, almost anyone in London with a European maternal line. So we are talking directly to you, the person wondering if the case is solved. The truth is, it's not. The mystery is as dark, as bloody, and as foggy as it was in 1888. But here is the most interesting part. Does this catastrophic failure of science mean Aaron Kosminsky wasn't the Ripper? Not necessarily. The thing is, Kosminsky remains one of the strongest, most compelling suspects, even without a single shred of DNA. Let's look at the facts from the time, not from a modern test tube. He lived in the absolute epicenter of the attacks in Whitechapel. He was a known violent misogynist, and most importantly, he was committed to an asylum in February 1891, right when the terrible Canonical 5 murders abruptly stopped. Top-ranking police officials at the time, including Chief Constable Melville McNaughton and Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the officer who oversaw the investigation, named Kosminsky in their private memos as their #1 suspect. They believed they had their man. They just couldn't prove it, supposedly because the only witness who identified him refused to testify. But what was Kosminsky really like? The records from the asylum paint a sad, down-to-earth picture that creates a paradox. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't a cunning predator. He was a deeply sick and pathetic man. Asylum notes describe him as paranoid, incoherent, and hearing voices from God. He refused to wash, would eat food he found in the gutter, and spent his days huddled in a corner, talking to himself, miserable and dejected. He remained institutionalized for 28 years until his passing. This is the great Kosminsky paradox. Was he a burnt-out case, a man whose mind was finally shattered by the very acts of butchery he committed? Or was he the perfect patsy, a poor, mentally ill Jewish immigrant who was easy to blame? The DNA test didn't solve the case. What it did do was drag this old, very strong, and very complicated suspect back into the light. The story isn't that the science gave us an answer. The story is that the attempt to use science created an entirely new mystery and a firestorm of controversy. The shadows, the DNA, ignored, but the intense, blinding focus on Kosminsky, both then and now, does something else. It allows the other, perhaps even darker theories to slip back into the shadows. The Ripper case is a forest of possibilities, and Kosminsky is just one very prominent tree. What if the truth lies elsewhere entirely? The Gentleman Monster, Montague John Druitt. While some police, like Swanson, pointed at Kosminsky, another high-ranking official, Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville McNaughton, had a different man in his sights. Montague John Druitt. Druitt is the classic Jekyll and Hyde suspect. By day, he was a respectable barrister and a schoolteacher, but his family, it was said, was tainted by madness. His own mother was institutionalized. Then on December 1st, 1888, just weeks after the horrifying murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the final and most brutal of the Canonical 5, Druitt vanished. A month later, his body was pulled from the River Thames, his pockets filled with stones. He had committed self-harm. For McNaughton, the timing was too perfect. The murder stopped precisely when Druitt eliminated himself. Inspector Aberline, the actual man on the ground, also supposedly believed Druitt was the monster. The theory, a respectable man on the outside, but inside a monster was clawing its way out. Did the sheer horror of the Kelly murder finally push him over the edge? The American Monster, Dr. Francis Tumblety. If Druitt was the quiet professional, Francis Tumblety was the loud, flamboyant showman. He was a flamboyant, mustachioed American quack doctor who made a fortune selling herbal remedies. He was also a raging, pathological misogynist known to rant about his hatred for all women, particularly those he deemed immoral. But here's where it gets chilling. Tumblety was known to host dinner parties where his prized possession was put on display, a collection of anatomical specimens, including, as rumor had it, several uteruses preserved in jars. He was in Whitechapel at the time of the murders. He was even arrested in November 1888, not for murder, but for gross indecency. While out on bail, as police were building a supposedly larger case against him, Tumblety fled. He slipped out of England, first to France, then back to the United States. Did Jack the Ripper simply escape justice by crossing the Atlantic? The unthinkable conspiracy, the royal plot. This is the wildest theory of all. It's a theory so scandalous, so vast, it doesn't just point to a lone monster, it points to a nefarious plot that goes straight to the very top of the British Empire. It points to Buckingham Palace. The suspect, Prince Albert Victor Eddie, the Duke of Clarence, the grandson of Queen Victoria and the future King of England. The story, as outlined in books like Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, is this. Prince Eddie, known to be listless and dim-witted, secretly married a Catholic commoner in Whitechapel. They even had a child. When Queen Victoria found out, she was furious. The monarchy was threatened. The canonical 5 victims were supposedly friends of Eddie's new wife, and they were threatening to blackmail the crown. The solution? A brutal, state-sanctioned cleanup. The Queen dispatched her own physician, Sir William Gull, a high-ranking Freemason, to silence the women. The murders weren't the work of a madman, they were cold, calculated, ritualistic executions. This, proponents say, explains the surgical skill of the mutilations. Gull was a doctor. It explains the supposed Masonic graffiti found at one scene. And it explains the most baffling part of the case, the total abject failure of the police to catch anyone. They weren't failing, they were covering it up. The hidden hand, Jill the Ripper. But what if we've been looking for the wrong man all along? This theory, often dismissed, solves the case's greatest riddle. How did the monster drenched in blood walk the streets of Whitechapel without being noticed? The answer: the monster was a woman. Think about it. A man covered in blood would be stopped in an instant. But a woman, especially one dressed as a midwife, she could walk the alleys at 3 a.m., her clothes and bags stained crimson, and no one would look twice. They would just assume she was coming from another messy birth. This Jill the Ripper would have the anatomical knowledge. She would be able to gain the trust of the victims, luring them into dark corners. Her motive? Perhaps revenge against a cheating husband, or a moral crusade against the prostitute she blamed for disease. Or perhaps she was a woman like Mary Piercy, convicted in 1890 of a similarly brutal murder of a woman and child. This theory explains the one thing no one else can: how the monster simply vanished into the London fog. The DNA points one way, but the experts cry foul. Do you think Kosminsky was the Ripper, or is the real monster still lost to history? Let us know below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.